powerful form of communication that people have. And if the mainstream media won't cover our issues, then let's cover them our way. And we can do that with the help of Open Media Foundation.
There are a lot of things that are not heard in the corporate mainstream media that can have an airing through people in the community creating their own media and covering issues that aren't getting covered.
Commercial media is our primary tool for shaping public awareness, but it isn't designed to be democratic. And government, our primary tool for shaping public policy in many ways, isn't designed to be democratic either.
Most professional organizations, everyone has a lobbyist to represent their interests.
The people who are writing a lot of the legislation are not the elected officials or the staff paid by the country.
And so that's where you have this influence of money.
Right now, the Show Me State has no restrictions, zero, when it comes to the number of gifts legislatures can accept from lobbyists.
But who doesn't have lobbyists down there are your poor people.
The Open Media Foundation also works with governments who want to be more transparent and more accessible, especially small local governments where people can have the greatest impact.
Local politics is so very important because it touches our day-to-day life. We need to stay engaged, but that starts with observing the behaviors and the manners of the people that we put in office and hold them accountable.
Of the Town Council of Basalt, granting special review approval for
Our part is to provide a tool that establishes this culture, that allows people to understand how easy it is to find out what they need to know in order to make decisions not only for the now, but also for the future.
This should not be about money. This should be about making sure that everyone has access to the right to vote.
Open Media Project provides a practical tool that anyone can use on a day-to-day basis so that they become more aware of what's happening around them. That really creates an equal playing field for all of us.
As a citizen, we all have personal power. Our problem is sometimes as citizens, we give up our power too easy.
This influence of corporate media on our lives is so much bigger now than it's ever been before. We're all walking around with these little computers, these little TVs in our hands and consuming more media than at any point in history. And that's why now it's more important than ever to support the alternative, support alternative media, community media, nonprofit organizations like the Open Media Foundation. Every day you have a chance with your votes, with your voice, with your wallet. So please support community media. It really is in your hands.
Looking for a literary home? For more than 20 years, Lighthouse Writers Workshop has worked to support writers and readers across Colorado. Our workshops and events offer the education, advice, and community you need, whatever your writing level or background. Find out more at lighthousewriters.org.
Welcome back. This is live. We're here at the Open Media Foundation. Thank you for joining us either on television, on the radio 104.7 FM, or here in person. If you're watching from home or listening while you're driving in the car, feel free to come down and join us. We've got a great day of events happening. It's called Meet Your Media. A lot of great local organizations and national partners bringing together some media professionals, journalists, and members of the community. In this panel, we'll be talking about who's behind the news. But at 4:30, we'll be hosting a reception to close out Colorado Journalism Week. There'll be plenty of great food and drink here at 700 Calumet, and we hope that you can join us. But first, we're going to start with this conversation: who's behind the news? The panelists that are joining me today. Next to me is Gabrielle Bryant. She's an Emmy Award-winning freelance journalist, producer of projects including Colorado Inside Out, The New Black Experience. She's president of the Colorado Association of Black Journalists. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
John Murray is the Denver Post City Hall reporter. His political and government coverage focuses on Mayor Michael Hancock, City Council, and the impact of policy decisions on the people of Denver. Thank you for being here. Bruce Finley covers environment-related news, a longtime Post staff reporter and a lawyer. Bruce has won numerous journalism awards, working in 40 countries, including assignments in Iraq and around the Arab world, from Pakistan to Yemen following the 9/11 attacks. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks.
And our friend and neighbor Maeve Conran, she's the news director at KGNU, a community radio station with offices in Boulder and here in Denver. Her work has been recognized regionally and nationally, airing on stations across the globe from the NPR to BBC. Thank you for joining us, Maeve. So we're going to ask a few questions and then allow the audience as well to submit some questions. The first question I wanted to ask, this panel is called "Who's Behind the News?" Have any of you guys seen the what is that? The pitch session that's like the I can't even remember. There's like a news show that's like the gossip column and what the pitch sessions are about. TMZ.
Yeah, I don't watch it.
TMZ. Thank you. So some people, that might be as close as they ever get to understanding what like a pitch session looks like. What's something tell us a little bit about your guys' editorial meetings and pitch sessions, and maybe anything that might surprise the general public about those. We can jump in. Anyone can answer the question.
I'll start. I'll say that the Denver Post, I think from a reporter standpoint, we're generally not involved in the pitch sessions. It tends to be a lot with our editors who meet. There's a morning meeting and then there's a mid-afternoon meeting where they're not so much pitching stories, but deciding on where placement in the paper as well as timing online of stories we've already got in development. So the pitch sessions kind of happen on almost a one-on-one basis with our individual editors. I talked to the politics editor, Bruce has an editor who's different from mine, and generally what happens is it's not always on a daily basis, but more on a weekly basis. I sit down with my editor and say, hey, here's what is coming up in Denver City Hall and kind of surrounding city government that I think is really interesting and that we ought to pay attention to. This might be a story, this might not be a story, just kind of letting them know what's on my radar, as well as what I'm working on more long-term, stories that aren't necessarily based off the news, but are kind of larger stories.
Awesome.
I think I would concur with that, having worked there a couple decades now. I'm not sure there really is such a thing as a pitch session. Maybe that's something people are imagining is going on in newsrooms, but it really is increasingly dispersed. So the news arises with the frontline reporters that are out there working our sources, and we are paired with editors, as John said, and usually that's by phone or email or text, and they hear what we're up to, and we confer about why we think it matters, and then the editors who are at the headquarters newsroom will confer amongst each other. I'm not sure that schedule is that ironclad. Sometimes it's very fluid, but it's about priority, how much space to give in the print product, and maybe the timing of the launch for the various digital platforms that are increasingly our main ones.
Great.
Well, I'm a newsroom of one, so it's usually me talking to myself. But I am the only paid staff in the news department, but I rely on a huge group of volunteer producers. And so our pitch session is happening virtually in many ways. And often people ask me, can I just come in and watch how you put the morning news together? I'm like, that's fine, but it's going to be me sitting at a computer. That's kind of boring. But so a lot of it is happening digitally. We do have, depending on the show, I mean, we have a morning news show that happens Monday through Friday that includes headlines and magazine-style pieces about news of the day. And so there tends to be several producers in the studio. And so there's definitely a one-on-one meetings happening there. But some of the broader things really are happening digitally because we have a huge group of volunteer and community-sourced journalists and producers. So we have different groups, maybe different shows have a collective of hosts. They have their own meetings virtually and in person to map some of that out, but really so much of it really is happening digitally at this point. And a lot of the pitching, I get a phone call from a listener, I get an email from a listener, I get a listener who stops by the station, and so it's happening in so many different ways, but really digitally and virtually in so much of it.
Great, thank you. Gabby, anything to add?
I mean, I can pretty much corroborate all of those points. A lot of my pitch meetings are happening with myself as a producer of Colorado Inside Out, where we talk about a range of news topics. A lot of it is scrolling on John's feed on Twitter and kind of seeing what stories that he has coming up or some other reporters and just kind of taking that in and following the news stories that way. So
thank you. Yeah. So there's obviously a little bit of a crisis of trust in media right now, and there might be a crisis even of trustworthiness in media. That's more for you guys to talk about. But talk to us about how your organizations maintain journalistic integrity and areas where you see that falling short, both in your own organizations and just nationwide. I think it was a couple days ago, there was the Hannity issue where Hannity hadn't disclosed that he was represented by the same lawyer that he was, reporting on in regards to Trump. Other areas where you guys have seen these reputable news organizations or even your own have some, what are some of those hurdles around trust and bias?
One thing I would say right off the bat is that I think we're in a very hyper-aware media age because we're in a very politically aware age where people are very aware of politics, of the political divides. People are claiming sides more than they have in a long time. And I think that has made them more skeptical of how they view media, which is good in some ways. In some ways, they read into it things that may or may not be there. And I think one thing that local media, whether it's the Post or local TV, I see this happen on Twitter a lot, people, I think, form perceptions based on the 24-hour cable news, which follows a very kind of peculiar set of operating procedures compared to most of the rest of the media. And so you see things like Sean Hannity, who's not really a journalist, he's a talking head giving commentary. A lot of those folks are kind of seen as stand-ins for the rest of journalism. And so people will form perceptions based on that and then try to apply that to local reporters and saying, well, you must believe this because I saw this on CNN and they are biased, therefore you're biased. And so I think we're dealing with that kind of trickle down of perceptions more than we used to, just because people are paying attention to national news a lot more than they used to. And so I think that's one of the big challenges that we face. And I kind of embrace that in some ways to educate people about how local media works. And, Bruce and I were talking before this started, it's not that individuals don't have any bias, everybody comes with biases. But it's about whether you have a way to kind of understand what your own biases are and set them aside, which is what we as local journalists are trying to do.
Great. Any other thoughts to add?
Yeah, you want the public to be able to trust their system for getting them true information. And I think there's so many sources of data bits that come nowadays, what's coming across your phone. So there's a lot you might not be able to trust. But that's not necessarily stuff coming from the traditional established media. And I think by and large, folks who are savvy news consumers can see what they can trust. Attributed facts that have gone through a news organization with the vetting process that we have. That editor-reporter relationship is quite an important one, because it means that you have a vigorous cross-examination about basically every sentence you write before it comes up. So the best thing we can do, I think, and I agree with the premise here, I think that integrity matters more than ever now, is just to adhere to these established journalism method traditions. Follow our practice and make sure, even if we're low on bodies, that we get that cross-examination in before it's posted online. Professional reporters, when they report, are transparent. They identify themselves before they get information. We have methods that work, this objective method that John's referring to get at the truth, and then we can't pay sources for media. There are other information gathering agencies that can do things that we don't do. We don't do them largely because we don't think they work. I don't know. Have you ever waterboarded anyone to get the news? So I think if we adhere to our traditional methods, we'll be able to get true facts and put them out and maintain integrity. There is one really big challenge, though. You asked what we should do inside. I'm worried that, especially as we lose bodies, that we could fall victim to having our agenda set, not independently as it's supposed to be, but driven by the governments, corporations, companies, powerful individuals who can afford to work with communications firms and PR firms. A lot of people in our society cannot afford a PR firm. They feel voiceless, helpless. A guy last week told me, who do we turn to? And I just think now more than ever, reporters have got to use their own judgment on the news, and not be swayed by this onslaught of, of PR agencies and spin people.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's such an interesting time we're in now in journalism, and there are really important conversations happening around trust and transparency. And to John's point, I think a lot of that though is looking at journalism and news production as a monolith, as if it's all the same. And so local media outlets are being tarred with the same brush as some of the big cable networks in terms of some of these issues. We are in a very unique position because we are a community entity, and so we invite the community to come in and be content creators as well. And so in many ways that makes us incredibly transparent. It also sets its own set of challenges because we have a lot of folks who aren't coming up through the traditional ranks of traditional journalism. And then you have a lot of people who want to come in, they have an agenda for better or for worse, and they want that to go out on the air. And so as a community media entity, that sets its own challenges. We have our own internal regulations, like if you're running for office, you can't be on the air. That happens quite a lot. You know, but because we are inviting the community to participate, we maybe run into these issues a little bit more than traditional media sources because we are inviting the community to come in and participate. But I think because we also have that lends itself to a certain transparency, that the local community has a certain, you know, has a sense of trust in us, and because they can show up. We have community advisory board meetings. We invite people to participate in our boards and our committees and to come in and see how it's all happening. So.
Great. Anything to add, Gabby, to that one? No? Well, maybe I'll ask you a question just going back to that. So having those citizen journalists and volunteers, you know, involved with KGNU and making media on your station, what do you see as the gaps? I mean, there's a lot that citizens can do, and there's a lot that they can't do that some of these people on this panel with you and that you yourself do. What are those gaps that are left, and how might they, you know, how do you see them as opportunities for, like, this is where we need to focus our energies? There's so many professional media people that are just focused on the same kind of gossip stuff that the public are so happy to do for free. But then there's just a lot of gaps. So talk to us about those gaps and how they come to play at KGNU.
Well, there are gaps, I suppose, on both sides. I think citizen journalism, and I think traditional news outlets are looking at how citizen journalists can help fill in some of the gaps, particularly when we're seeing a depletion of local newsrooms. But community media has always just been about citizen journalism. Anyway, in terms of some of the gaps though that creates, you have a lot of people who come in and they're passionate about X, you know, whatever issue they're passionate about. And so you have a lot of people who want to come in and do coverage on news production on a certain issue. Less people want to sit through a city council meeting or a school board meeting or some of those really important areas that need to be covered. And so that's a gap in our regard in terms of how do I maybe direct some of our passionate citizen journalists into covering some of those areas. But in terms of the gaps that citizen journalists can come in and cover, I mean, they're bringing voices that have either been excluded or ignored or marginalised. You know, typically for a variety of reasons, we invite them to come in and participate. So they're filling the gaps in maybe in that knowledge base, if that makes sense. And so there are gaps in kind of both sides that we're trying to fill in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Good answer. And another kind of back and forth, when Bruce was talking about these journalistic kind of processes that you find work, and that, you know, having integrity, journalistic integrity, and the value for that. How is that value measured? Because if that value is measured by number of viewers and just public interest and advertising dollars, you could argue that maybe there isn't a lot of value for journalistic integrity in general, that there isn't a lot of value in transparency. It could be argued that the way to get eyeballs and whatever is not that. So talk to us about the value of that, and then how it happens if it doesn't happen just through the market.
Well, as a frontline reporter, I guess my quick answer there would be value is measured in completing the mission. So the mission of journalism is it's a society's system for getting the people it serves, you know, true facts needed for self-rule and to live well in a democracy. It's always been bound up with democracy since the Roman Senate started posting that Papyrus Diurna of the day's public business out there, and I think that's how we would measure it. Is it true? The primary loyalty for journalists is the people we serve, and so you raised some really interesting points and things we've all been chewing on as we develop these new platforms. A lot of old news organizations like the Post have kind of pioneered these modern delivery systems. But in doing that, we've had to think about things like, wow, everyone seems to click on these stories and they took 15 minutes to prepare. And not many people are clicking on the massive project. What do we do? So I'd go back to the mission of journalism and the ability to execute the mission for the people that we're serving. That would be my criteria.
Great. And Gabby, do you have any thoughts on just like the current state of media where, again, the way to get eyeballs isn't necessarily to do the kind of thing that Bruce is talking about, and the way to get money is to get eyeballs, and it's this kind of conundrum. We don't have a lot of publicly funded media. We don't necessarily consider our media to be just an inherent responsibility of our government or our taxes or anything like that, and yet the market isn't proving to really subsidize, you know, effective media at the level we're looking for, or that I imagine at least you and I are looking for. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I like the space that we are in with journalism and media, where citizen journalism provides opportunities for news organizations like Denverite.com to thrive, or Colorado Independent, where people who are looking for other news sources that aren't the mainstream Denver Post have an opportunity to potentially, you know, freelance and contribute to the news cycle. I think a lot of what's missing from mainstream news is real everyday people. So you have the folks that are career journalists, and that's what they do, and that's amazing, because we need those folks who have gone to journalism school, and you know, those folks who have a stake in their community. But we also need everyday people who experience news stories, and they're not just reporting on the news, but they live through some of the news. They know people who have experienced different types of news. And so I think this is a really exciting time because, you know, because everyone has access to media and different forms of media, we have opportunities to see news from different perspectives.
And I would add that I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity for citizen journalism. But there's also, for people who see it, whether it's through social media or on websites or other places, where you need a lot more media literacy to be able to understand, or at least be attuned to, like, can you trust it? It's a lot of times you can, sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's subtle agendas that come through, just because the people who are most interested and might kind of see themselves as citizen journalists are the people who are most interested in that particular issue, and they may want to sway readers to a certain side. And there's a place for that in journalism. Like, we have opinion pages in the Denver Post, for instance. But I think that it puts a bigger challenge on readers and viewers to be able to kind of sort through all this information. And this is why you see so many, you know, whether it's memes or just false news stories taking off on social media. That it's kind of a function of that, because people are confronted with information that they may see passed on by a family member or a friend. They don't know whether it's true or not, but it might confirm their biases. They might want it to be true, so they share it and it passes on, and things go viral that way. And I think there's a very human psychology behind this, that every day, whether it's media or just the public at large, we all have to combat it.
Mm-hmm. And when you say we all have to combat it, but we're also, so many of us are actually doing it and perpetuating it, where do you think that, what is the gap? What is missing for people who maybe just don't see much value in that? I mean, we used to have a receptionist here at the building where if you'd stand long enough at the front desk, she'd show you some conspiracy theory stuff that she just just really enjoyed pursuing, and maybe in some ways she wanted to be true, or it fit with her kind of view about the unfair ways the world has worked for her and stuff like that. So, what is it that, I mean, I never knew what to say to her when she showed me those videos. You know, what is it that's missing? If you say we all want that, but some of us really don't.
I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but I think that we're kind of going through this kind of transitional technological period where we're adapting to like the internet's been around for a long time, but we're adapting to social media and how that changes the way that we can get information and perceive things. And I think that I'm hopeful that in the next few years, kind of as a society, we'll adapt to this and become a little bit more skeptical, become a little bit more media literate, understand that we got to pay attention to sources that we trust and disregard sources that we don't trust. But I'm not sure where that's headed.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from anyone on this transition?
Well, the big thing
period?
is we all need to acknowledge, and I think we're all reluctantly doing it, young people aren't reading newspapers and they're not listening to the radio. I just did a workshop with some very inspiring young women, high school students in Denver, just, about media and media literacy. And I work a lot with students, and we get a lot of interns from the journalism school at CU and Metro State. And even journalism students aren't reading newspapers, and they're not listening to the radio. And so all of that news is coming to them through social media. So like it or not, that's the reality.
One, can I add on to that? I think that it's not, so I think young people absolutely are not, subscribing as nearly as big of numbers to a print newspaper that's delivered to their door. They're generally not reading it in print form. But the Denver Post has more readers than we've ever had. It's people that are reading it online. But to your point, they come to it differently. They come to individual articles, often through social media or by searching for something on Google, and one of our articles pops up on that topic. So I think one of the interesting things that you see is that, in the olden days when I was a kid 20 years ago, you come across stories that you didn't know you would be interested in because you're just reading a newspaper and things pop out at you and you just kind of give them a chance, and you find things that you don't know that you have that interest until you see it. And I think that's contributing, the way that we consume media online is contributing to kind of how we're in silos, because you only read an article that you know that you're going to be interested in these days because you're following it from Facebook or from Twitter or from you're searching for that topic. And so we have more information than we know what to do with out there, but people only read what they're particularly interested in. And so they come to the Denver Post website or read us on our apps and things like that, but it's only kind of like popping in and out as opposed to like coming and going through and reading a whole bunch of articles all at once. And that's just how our media diets have changed.
Yeah, perhaps it's useful to distinguish the delivery system from journalism. I mean, in modern democracies, I don't think anyone would dispute that the people who live there need and deserve, for effective self-rule, to have professional news gatherers who can get them true facts that they need. And that's the journalism. And the delivery system, we've sort of jumped over to the forms that the young people do read it on. They read on the smartphone increasingly, but they're reading the content produced by news organizations. And so we don't really have a circulation problem. I think there are 8.6 million unique visitors a month at the Denver Post now. We have a revenue problem. As far as community journalism, also, from the discussion here, I would just like to add, I don't think those of us who are working as our day jobs as journalists feel in any way sort of opposed to citizen journalists. I kind of see it like citizen journalism like citizen science. It's really limitless. It's limited only by its ability to adopt and apply a method that can get true facts. I had a federally funded science buddy who said, I don't really like all these people investigating the air, land, and water because I can't trust their data. It doesn't meet the data protocols. Same with citizen journalism, to the extent that it can, be vetted, have that sort of cross-examination between the editors and the writers of the news, then it becomes journalism. It's not amateur journalism anymore. It's following a professional method. It's really limitless. It is scary, though, because you could put out anyone can deliver false news a long way nowadays. And so to have a lot of empowered citizen journalists without the training and perhaps even the suggestion that it could substitute in a democracy for having professional journalists is sort of like saying, well, maybe we should substitute our voting system. I mean, for something as fundamental to a survival of a democracy as having a free flow of information, true facts to people, that's what's scary for us as we get down to 24 frontline gatherers.
And do you believe it belongs in the market? I mean, this isn't like a socialist question. We have things in our society, whether it's our roads or our military or something that we don't just leave up to the market. I'm just still personally just super confused about how this works in the market, because the market ends up rewarding like the InfoWars of the journalism world, and and if we see that that's not helping a democracy, and if we feel like we care about a democracy, I don't expect the four of you guys to necessarily answer that question, but if you have any thoughts on it, I would be really interested to hear.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is that the Denver Post has sort of had a citizen journalism experiment that actually was started by the Rocky Mountain News, the other newspaper in town, rest in peace, that ended in 2009, and they started something called Your Hub, which still exists in a slightly different form now. The Denver Post, it's kind of community journalism that is zoned around the metro area, so where you live that dictates which section you get. And unfortunately, through our latest round of cuts, we've cut down the number of reporters who were right for those sections. But one thing that it still has, and that has had since the beginning, was an opportunity for citizen journalism, for submitted articles from anybody. Like there's just literally a web form that you can go to submit an article about your neighborhood or about your organization, things like that. And what you see is that 9 times out of 10, it's PR people writing those things. And it's been that way since it started. Those are the people with resources and who hire professional writers, hired guns. They saw this as a way to get their news out. And those are screened to an extent, but a lot of it's just press releases that didn't result in stories. So they submit that on there, and so their press release about some new community project or a hospital project or a company announcement ends up in Your Hub. And it's labeled as such, and there's transparency of who submitted it and that sort of thing, so they know that it's not one of our reporters who's doing it. But I think that is an interesting illustration of when you provide these opportunities, regular people don't have time to do things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who have time to do that are those who are paid to do that by people with interests.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to that end, citizen journalism and community media can never replace professional news outlets. I mean, we rely on what you guys are doing in many ways for stories and for, we credit the Denver Post in our headlines every day because we don't have people at City Hall and at all these places that we would love to have that. In terms of
we rely on you.
Oh, good, thanks. It's
symbiotic. Once there was a carp fly fisherman in Denver, and he was suddenly chest deep in black goo spreading into the water between the Sand Creek and the South Platte River, and he went home on his blog and ranted about it, how horrible it was. And a guy who reads his blog in Boise saw that and said, "Wow!" And he left a phone message on my answering machine. I just happened to be circling through the newsroom that night, and I listened. I said, "Wow, that's curious." So first thing in the morning, I called the state health department, and they didn't know about any spill. Yeah. And then the county didn't know about it. And then I called the EPA's NRC line, and they said, "No, we haven't heard about that." At which point I'm going out to just look at it because I was so curious. But then the EPA actually launched a response, and it became a major federal emergency. And it all started with the extra eyes and ears that citizen journalists can provide.
I mean, I think it's all part of the conversation. I mean, I think the concern is in terms of if you're looking at news from a profit perspective. Now, I'm coming from a non-profit media perspective and a community-funded media, essentially, public radio. If there is a tendency to say, oh, well, we can just have citizens create this content for free, I mean, then you leave it open to, well, you're outsourcing journalists, losing those jobs, and then you leave it open to these, groups that can then pay to submit it in the form of, community-submitted content, and that's not really what's going on. I mean, I think we're at a very crucial time now in terms of where journalism is going, and how it's being funded as well. And there's an extreme case now, obviously, with the Denver Post and what's happening with hedge fund ownership too. At the other end of that spectrum, you have public media that has to fight every single day to get people to pay for the content. And the reality is people don't seem to want to pay for content. And getting back to the digitally available content, so much of that is online, and I know and available for free. And I know the paywall was reintroduced at the Denver Post, and other newspapers are doing that. People are finding ways around that. So I think we need to have a fundamental conversation about who's paying for this. It has to be paid for. Some news production, there's a financial cost to it. It can't all be done for free. Even community-centric organisations like us, we've got bills to pay. We've got to have staff. We've got to have the facilities. I mean, there's got to be, I think, a consciousness raising within community and society that this stuff's got to get paid for. I mean, I come from Ireland, and we have a similar model that they do in Britain in terms of a license fee. So if you've got a television or radio, you have a license fee and you got to pay it, you know, or you'll be fined, or, you know, you will get into trouble. Because there's a general attitude that someone's got to pay for this stuff. You know what I mean? It can't all be given out for free. And so I'm not sure anybody has a solution that would work over here. But I'm glad that the discussions are at least happening, and I hope people acknowledge that, you know, public media and community-funded media and community radio has been part of this mix for a really long time, and looking for alternate ways of funding news and media in general.
I think there's I'm cautiously hopeful, kind of along those lines, that I think, you know, one thing that newspapers did that was a great disservice to themselves, and was for years giving away all of our content for free online. You know, we were trying to innovate, we were trying to adapt to kind of this new technological way of getting information out. But we also trained a lot of people to expect information just to be free, and just as a matter of course. And I think people are starting to slowly reevaluate that and say, oh, maybe I ought to pay for to support a news organization that I trust. I think it's interesting that in Colorado Public Radio is one of the better supported NPR stations in the country for a market this size. They have a very, it's a very educated market, and people, when you ask them, are willing to step up, and I think Colorado Public Radio shows that. They have very successful fund drives, and I think even Denver Post, we put our paywall back up in, I think it was January, and we're starting to see some modest success with that. There are people who are subscribing. When you ask them to, they follow through. We certainly get a lot of complaints about it too, but I think that people are slowly turning around on that, and it'll just take time.
Oh, I did just want to say something completely off topic, but it was something that we brought up in terms of maybe the production of news hasn't changed, but the delivery system has a little bit, and so to maybe see the value in terms of younger people are getting news through social media. I mean, I've always just been an advocate of reading a newspaper cover to cover, read the business section, read the letters to the editor, and read the articles that you typically wouldn't click on a computer. But Snapchat, this is a whole new thing that I've heard about recently, that a lot of young people are getting news through Snapchat. So they're getting literally a visual, and I wonder how many are clicking through to read an entire piece. So everything is kind of getting boiled down to a headline. And so you don't really get that full media literacy, even if you are taking the time to get some kind of news information online. You know, how you consume it is important as well, because if you're only looking at the headline and you're not clicking through and reading the entire article, I mean, that's problematic as well. So.
Well, I'm going to encourage members of the audience to continue to submit questions. I'm going to ask a few that they've handed in. And again, if you're watching at home on television or listening on the radio 104.7 FM, please consider coming down and joining us. We've got more events. It's a great time to talk to your local media professionals and neighbors, and we have great food and drink coming up. Lots of stuff happening for the rest of the day here at 700 Calumet. So please consider joining us. So some questions that have just come in. Let's see. TV reporters especially are often called on to offer their analysis as well as facts to fill the 24/7 news cycle. According to, what does that say?
James Fallows.
James Fallows. Is that happening in print too? I.e., why are post stories so long these days?
I'll take a stab at that. I think there was two questions there, kind of interrelated, but I think that as news reporters, we actually have a lot of conversations along the lines of let's make sure that we're reporting the news and not commenting on it. Let's make sure that you know, we're feeding the public conversation with information to allow them to form opinions, and that's kind of the grand goal of what we do, right? And I think that we also have conversations about length of stories a lot more than we used to. You know, there's finite space in print, so it's actually kind of the bane of my existence that we have this tool online that for stories that truly deserve it, we can write a whole bunch of information and people can just choose to stop reading when they want to, but we have to condense it sometimes for print and cut certain parts of the story out just to make it fit. And so I have this back and forth all the time with our editors. We don't have a great system for kind of figuring out where to draw the lines there. But at the same token, I've also had editors kind of rightfully bring up with me, like, I know that you think this story is absolutely fascinating, John, but people just don't want to read that much about it. And so, yeah, to your point, we I think are having those conversations, and we need to be vigilant about that and just kind of understand that people are when they click on a story or are reading a story in the paper, they're giving us their time, and so we have to make it worthwhile for them. And our job is to distill, sometimes just to distill what the important news is, and to decide just as much what not to print as what to print. And hopefully they'll trust our judgment, and hopefully we earn that trust. But that's an ongoing conversation.
I think for reporters, we're encouraged to develop and apply some sort of analytical insight into deciding what matters, and to decide what merits spending the man hours to do an investigation. But if it's a news article and it's an analysis, just like an opinion, it's labeled that way. Opinions, again, all labeled opinion, and they're on that one page, which is a separate part of the news operation. A lot of people think newspapers' editorial pages are traditionally coming from the editor of the newspaper, but that's a separate thing direct from the publisher. So the editorial board of the New York Times is independent even of the opinion section. So I think it's important to keep the labels clear, and I'm not sure what sort of blurring the question is referring to on television, but I think in the mainstream news orgs like ours, we try to be very clear. If it's an analysis, really an analysis, then we'll label it an analysis, or opinion if it's an opinion. Otherwise, it's a news article.
And I think that some folks, maybe what the blurring of lines may be referring to is like, we get pushback sometimes. You know, as a reporter at City Hall, I've done that for 4 years here. I covered City Hall in Indianapolis before I was here. And so I'm also aware that on some topics I have a little bit of expertise to offer sometimes. I may know some of the historical background. I may be able to connect some of the dots for readers. And so we try to be careful in doing that, not to offer an opinion about it, but to kind of help contextualize a story. Some people will see that as editorializing. So sometimes there are some gray areas there that we just have to be cognizant of.
And I like how what you were saying relates to what we were talking about with Maeve earlier, that the public can share their opinions about the news and information going out so easily for free. That's not something that makes a lot of sense for like the finite resource of journalists to be spending a lot of time on. And I think the questioner was also referencing that when you watch TV, so much of that is just what's happening. What do you think about this happening? And what do you think about that happening? And yeah, to the average consumer, there might not be much distinction between that and journalism, but it would be nice if we had a clear distinction. Like that there is a distinction there, and most people may not see that difference in the editorial page or that part of what they see on television news and the part that would be journalism.
And we have those comments after the stories online. So one of the duties of journalism to the citizens it serves is to facilitate that public conversation. And so it's amazing sometimes the sorts of discussions that'll go on in those queues. We had in a story this week, someone found an opportunistic photo of a malfunction at an oil refinery, and they happened to have that on their smartphone. And so in the comment portion below the story, they posted their photo, sort of like a Snapchat photo. And it was really useful. It added so much to the news coverage. And so to the extent we create a public forum, we want it to be interactive. And the new delivery systems enable that.
Great. Another question from the crowd. As journalists, are you optimistic about efforts by foundations or philanthropy to save the news and save local journalism? Or about any of the work being done at Facebook or Google? What do you think is their role? Gabby, you have any thoughts on that?
Not necessarily. I mean, I work for a community station, so of course we thrive and live and survive off of philanthropy efforts and donations from foundations, so I think it's essential, but I actually think these gentlemen might have a little more insight into that question. We're just
reporters. That foundation stuff's above our pay grade. But it's clear we are really profitable at the Denver Post. We're the flagship of this big chain. And so we as I said before, we don't really have a circulation problem, we have a revenue problem. We may be close. The key is going to be this. It's going to be subscription. Maybe foundations, public financing, there's going to be a lot of room for innovation on finding the revenue model for modern media serving a democracy. But, and I totally agree with what you said about us being at a turning point now. I mean, it really isn't guaranteed that you'll have a robust fourth estate right now. That's why the three things: number one, subscribe. It's as important as voting. I mean, we'll have to get to the point where we pay the true cost of getting true information. And then I think after that, second, some sort of conceptual clarity about the mission of journalism. We could all sharpen up a little bit. There's so much misunderstanding of what the mission of journalism even is these days. And then third, I think we should demand that our government, our companies, friends, don't just try to manipulate the media, but treat it with some respect, the way you treat the voting system with some respect. I think public officials should be expected to stand up and discuss public business and not hide behind spokespeople and have agency people trying to be gatekeepers for public information. I mean, we've got to treat our system with some sort of respect if we don't want to break it, especially in a kind of precarious moment.
I think the issue of foundations funding news is huge, and it's a big discussion happening, certainly in radio, and I'll talk about just that specific medium, because there are fewer and fewer freelance opportunities, and I've seen this a lot in environmental reporting and science reporting, where and it wasn't even that long ago, I used to freelance, and you could pitch a news, a syndicated show or a station a particular story, and they would have a very clear funding model. Okay, we pay this much per minute, and da 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 da. Those opportunities are going away. What's happening now is you have a lot of content being distributed for free. So where's the funding coming from? A lot of it's coming from foundations. And I'm not sure the public really understands all of that. And we've seen it play out quite a bit. Like the Walton Family Foundation are funding a lot of projects on the Colorado River, some of them being reporting projects. There are, the Gates Foundation is involved in funding media. Now, whether or not there is any influence editorially on that, you need to look at the individual news entity. But I do think the public needs to understand that how reporting is funded in many ways, aside from, say, traditional entities like a newspaper or a television station that has a fund and pays journalists. Say for freelance stuff, and a lot more reporters are freelancing now, that's being funded through various different foundations, and I think it would be really helpful if the public knew that a little bit more. I think we need to be a lot more transparent when we do present information, that if there is a foundation funding it, like I said, the editorial relationship is a different conversation, and you need to look at each different news entity, but the public really needs to understand there are a lot of foundations funding very specific news stories out there, for better or for worse. But that's how a lot of news is being paid for these days.
For the record, we've rejected some of those opportunities at a time we really could have used the funding. Hard choice made, at the manager level, but one I'm pretty proud of. I know some bigger news organizations have decided to take advantage of those options, and sometimes with transparency it can be done.
Yeah, exactly. I think transparency certainly is key, but I think just a broader conversation on how this is actually really infiltrating a lot of media and a lot of reporting right now, and it's being funded. And getting back to, someone's got to pay for the news. So if the public doesn't want to pay for it, someone's going to step into that gap and fund the news.
I've been very gratified the last few weeks. I mean, there's no way to not just say that it's been a very tough time at the Denver Post lately. The job cuts that we've had to go through after having rounds in the last several years, there's no way to put a positive varnish on that. But I've been very gratified after the editorial board took a very public stand a few weeks ago about our ownership and what they saw as the need for new ownership. It's in the conversation here, both locally and nationally, and I think people are more attuned to it than they've ever been. This is a common thing in the newsroom, I know, but when I talk to sources and when I talk to regular folks, they ask us, how are you guys doing and what can we do to help? And I think that that's so great to have people be attuned to that. And I don't always have the best answer for them other than, please support us in any way you can. If you can afford a subscription, please do that. Support any effort going forward. There was some news in the last couple of weeks that a group out of Colorado Springs is trying to put together some kind of a investor group to buy the Denver Post. I don't know if that's going to be successful. I kind of hope it is, but as of now, there's kind of a pledge of I think some seed money. That's going to have to grow quite a bit probably if they're going to be able to entice our owner to sell us. But the fact that there are these irons in the fire, I think, is very encouraging.
Great. One more question from the crowd. What happens when a community's media, their journalists and publishers and editors, are not representative of the people they cover? In Denver, Colorado, media is much wider than the residents, for example. Any thoughts on that?
That's something that's bothered me a whole lot. I think that since I got to the Denver Post, because there are seniority rules in the way that job cuts are carried out generally, the diversity efforts of the last 10 years have been blown to bits by layoffs. A lot of the people who've had to leave because they volunteered for a buyout, if they were a more veteran person, or because they got laid off, were people of color and people from minority groups. And I think that really hurts our ability to comprehensively cover our community, notwithstanding the fact that we're getting smaller, so that just the size of us hurts our ability to cover the community.
Any other thoughts on that one? We've got quite a few more questions.
I mean, I think that's the way news has always been. So honestly, it's sad, but I think even the space in which we are with news is representative of Colorado's population, for example. Colorado's population is only 4 to 6% black. I'm not sure, what the other demographics are like, but I feel like the newsroom is representative of that, and it's quite unfortunate, which is why I like to support smaller organizations, even like, Colorado Public Television, like I said, Denverite.com, which are able and are focused on hiring people of color who are able to, they're just everyday people who can tell stories, because you remove that layer of what, traditional journalists, which is usually white male, what they think is important to the rest of the public. And that might be why a lot of people aren't consuming news, because it's not important to them, it's not relevant to them, it's not things that they feel that they need in their everyday life. And that's not something that's new, that's been that way.
And I think even community organizations like KGNU and even ones that actively invite the community in need to work at this all the time to make sure they're reaching communities. It's not enough to have an open door policy and say, come on in and contact us if you want to get involved. You've got to actively go out and find communities that haven't been included, but also acknowledge that when you're asking people to volunteer or, in citizen journalism, we're asking them to do it for free, essentially. That brings its own level of barriers too. I mean, there are only certain people with a certain amount of privilege who can give a lot of time to participate for free, and so we have to be very, very aware of all those things, even when it's, organizations that pride themselves on going out and finding the community. When you're asking people to participate and to give of their time, any of that's going to, bring to the top people who have the privilege, who've got, several hours a week, who can come and do this, and who have, the wherewithal to do that. And, we don't offer paid internships, and I work very hard at trying to give people a really positive experience when they come, because we can't pay them, but I understand that is a huge barrier for many people in the community, getting involved.
We've got a few more questions from the audience, and I think we're running short on time, so we'll just try and be brief in the answers to these. But according to U.S. media is more polarized than in Europe. Any thoughts from any of you on what's the difference here? What are your comments on why studies would find our media much more polarized?
I guess I need to have some clarity on what that question means. Do you mean the editorial pages of different newspapers seem to be on different sides of the political spectrum? There's certainly a loud public debate now as ever in a democracy, but media polarized, I'm not quite sure.
I would say there's a lot of polarization in European media. Certainly in print media, they're dealing with the same issues as we are, but they do have, as I said, a lot of more publicly funded, certainly broadcast media, television and radio. It just exists as a model, so it's a different way of doing it.
I just recently saw an interview with Alberto Ibargüen from the Knight Foundation, who mentioned that when he was visiting media institutions in Europe, when he was part of the Miami Herald, and they were asking, what's the slant, what's the angle of the Herald, and he's like, well, we're fair and balanced. I'm sure he didn't use those words, but back when they meant something, and they just kind of laughed. So at least he was indicating that there's there's more of a culture of just be transparent about our biases there. I don't know, but I'm wondering if that's any of your experience.
Perhaps the cable network newses are more overtly partisan now than they used to be. I'm not sure, but through the commenters that are on there. And I guess the tradition of journalism in Europe's a bit different. I mean, they've also evolved very sophisticated systems for informing people in their democracies. I'm pretty proud of the U.S. system. My theory is I don't think we'd have independence from British colonial rule if we hadn't developed a way to move information pretty well. Think of those early Revolutionary War battles where it kind of hinged on, you know, the revolutionaries knew that the British were coming to get their guns. And the Founding Fathers here certainly kind of prioritized this free press. It made it the First Amendment above all those other amendments. And so, I mean, I think we have a pretty strong tradition in U.S. The Zenger case here, 1720, is the established truth, a legal precedent, truth as a defense to libel. A printer had dared to criticize the colonial governor in New York, and they locked him up, and he went on trial, and that established that precedent here. So I think the U.S. journalism heritage is strong and a bit different from in Europe, and so it's less partisan here.
And it's diverged over time. I think if you look back at American history, the first 100 years of the Republic, partisan newspapers were the norm, and there were very few who were trying to eke out a reputation as being kind of down the middle and like has taken hold more over the last 100 years or so. And yeah, I don't know if we're going to head back in that direction, but I think I hope we don't. I think that the system we have now serves us pretty well if we can make it sustainable.
Great. And a final question from the audience, and I'd have each of you answer this. Any reflection on ways you've seen your own entities, your own institutions, your own projects fall short of those goals that Bruce was talking about, and then you personally, anything that you are intending to do about that? Do you have any examples?
I'm terrified, frankly, that with less bodies we will be driven again by the people who are in power and can afford a public relations firm. And there's just a constant flow into newsrooms of all these releases. They call them a news release. And it's quite a controlling thing to face. And I think it's on us to get out there in every community, our duties to every community in the city, especially the folks that feel like the guy told me last week, I don't know where to go to. Professional journalists have the duty to be out and hear that, and to operate in Spanish in this community. And so if we have a failing, it's that due to lack of bodies, we're really hard-pressed to do that. It's super intense triage these days. We want to be alert if the EPA is announcing something, but we also have to figure out what really matters most. And most people don't have an EPA press service to try to spin us, or a mayor's press office, or a governor's press office. So how do we keep that on our radar all the time?
I mean, resources are crucial to all of this. I mean, certainly as a community-centric media organisation, we get so many people who have an agenda who want to come on and use our platform to get their agenda out, and that sometimes happens. We have our own internal mechanisms for trying to avoid that, but it certainly happens, and we're constantly vigilant of it, and just always going back to our mission. Are we serving the community? Are we best serving the community? And are we, bringing those underrepresented voices to the fore?
Anything else?
I will continue and train and talk to the journalists that I work with through the Colorado Association of Black Journalists, or just people that I run into, to continue to be advocates for their community, to continue to be a part of their community, to volunteer, to serve on nonprofits, to continue to fight for the stories that they feel are important in the spaces that they are in. And I feel like if we do that, we can continue to have balanced coverage that doesn't just focus on what the mainstream media wants to project or are able to project because of time or funding. And so that's what I'll continue to do.
Great. Thank you. All right, so again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. This is part of a day-long series of events wrapping up Colorado Journalism Week. Up next, we're going to have a panel streamed from New York City. We'll be showing it in here as well as upstairs. And then Once that panel's over, about 4:30 p.m., we'll be having a reception upstairs with a number of lightning round presentations from about almost a dozen different community media organizations and media organizations throughout the state. It's going to be an awesome reception upstairs. I want to thank some of our sponsors who will be providing some food and drink up there. You have to stick around after the next panel because the food is going to be coming from, we want to thank the sponsors, Sexy Pizza, Lagunitas Brewing, we'll have some beer and drinks upstairs, Crazy Mountain Brewing Company. And that's probably it. There'll also be some vegetarian fare from our friends at City O City. So I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you guys for coming. And again, if you're watching at home on Denver Open Media Channel 56 or 57, 881, or listening on the radio 104.7, this is live. It's April 21st, 2018, and we hope you come down and join us again for these closing ceremonies of Colorado Journalism Week. 700 Calumet, right in the Santa Fe Arts District. We welcome you to come and meet some of your neighbors and lots of local journalist entities. We appreciate you guys joining us, and thank you guys so much for all you had to say. We appreciate it. Thank you. One last mention before we go. You also upstairs you'll be able to see a new project, a new initiative that we're part of called the Colorado Media Alliance, which is a group of media entities, including some of the people at this table and in the previous panel, who are focused on elevating stories around media literacy, around trust in media, and around transparency in general, both transparency of our governments and transparency of our media institutions. You can learn about them at cma.media, coloradomediaalliance.media. There'll be a booth upstairs where you can learn a little bit more. There's a whole series of events happening that the Colorado Media Alliance is part of. This is just the first of many. Next week we'll be participating along with the Colorado Press Association, the Colorado State Legislature, and the DU Journalism program that'll happen both at the Capitol, also at DU at the Cable Center, and at the Colorado Press Club. So we hope that you guys can learn about all these great events happening and just be part of this continued evolution of our media landscape here in Denver. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube